G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm sure that everybody who's familiar with my channel will be totally familiar with the fact, the concept, the idea, the meme that I am personally not in favour of my local Member of Federal Parliament, Barnaby Joyce, Barneybaby Joyce, Barnaby Joyce, Barnaby Joyce. Leader of the National Party of Australia, Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Minister for various sundry other things. In fact, I'm so not in favour of Barneybaby Joyce that I actually run a sticker on the back of my car explaining just what a bad parliamentarian he is. And when I say that he's a bad parliamentarian, what I mean is that he doesn't always tell the truth. He's not always honest. Sometimes Barnaby Joyce is a hypocrite. Those of you familiar with my channel may recall that 3 or 4 months ago I made a video standing here back in the days when the wattle was flowering. And I pointed out that Barnaby Joyce, who claims to care so much about law and order in Australia and the way the nation runs, who'd had himself elected for 10 or 15 years previously, had actually, in reality, he'd cared so little for the laws of Australia that he hadn't bothered to find out whether he was in fact a dual citizen of New Zealand by descent. And therefore, thus and because me and my electorate and all the other people who live here, the 100,000 of us, we had to go back to the ballot box to decide whether Barnaby Joyce was actually fit to sit in Parliament. After he'd been busted, after the Prime Minister said the High Court of Australia will so hold that Barnaby Joyce is fit to sit in Parliament, and the High Court of Australia said, piss off, Malcolm. You're entirely wrong. Barnaby Joyce is not fit to sit because he was a dual citizen when he was first elected. Therefore, he had to sit again. And during the election campaign, it emerged that Barnaby Joyce had been having an affair with his press secretary. And I got to say that even though all of this was happening during the age of Harvey Weinstein, the age of thou shalt not sexually intimidate or harass or molest anybody within thy work environment, Barnaby Joyce's press secretary stopped working for him in April, and she had to go away and work for somebody else. And then on the 20th of October, the Sydney Telegraph newspaper carried a front page story explaining how come Barnaby Joyce's marriage had fallen apart and why the National Party was so terribly afraid of what might happen if Barnaby Joyce's electorate was to hear about how he had adulterously fornicated with his press secretary. And then his wife kicked him out. And then his press secretary, ex-press secretary, became pregnant. And yet he came back here to the New England tablelands where he'd been standing ever since he came to New South Wales after he'd previously stood as and been elected as a Queensland senator. And he didn't let anybody know. It wasn't until after he was re-elected that he admitted in Parliament, under parliamentary privilege, that he was separated from his wife. But during the election campaign, other things went on. Whereas I'd only been concerned about the fact that Barnaby Joyce has a record of corruption and crony capitalism in favour of agriculturalists who are making a mess of the Australian environment, particularly the Murray-Darling Basin. Like, is it 18 billion or $30 billion worth of money that Barnaby Joyce's corrupt irrigationist mates have stolen from the basin? I don't know. Can't recall. The figures are sort of ambiguous and amorphous, and nobody tells me very much about them. But the thing is that yesterday, the story of Barneybaby Joyce and his pregnant girlfriend hit the front pages of the Australian newspapers. And for a very brief period, perhaps 24 hours, it made the news. And whereas 2 months ago, I published a video about Barneybaby Joyce, adulterous, philandering lowhound, too scared to campaign. 119 views, 5 likes, 1 dislike. Wherein at I explained the fact that there had been a newspaper article on the 20th of October in the Sydney Telegraph on the front page explaining that Barnaby Joyce's office staffer had left his employ because they were having a relationship, and then subsequently Barnaby's wife had found out about it, and Barnaby's wife had kicked him out of the house. And I put that video up on the 17th of November, aka 2.5 months ago. Then, 2 months ago, I posted a video of Barnaby Joyce getting heckled and badgered in Glen Innes. 1,603 views, 42 likes, 1 dislike. So let's have a bit of a look at that video.
Happening in full view. We're going great, Barnaby. How's your family values, Barnaby? And how's the girlfriend in Canberra? There's no answer for that second question.
Yeah. What happened was that Barneybaby went bright red in the face, and he shut up and he stopped trying to answer it. You can see by the colour coding difference between the back of the journalist's head and the front of Barnaby's face just how red he actually went. And then later on that day, Barnaby went over to Graham near Inverell, and somebody else asked him the same sort of question, and he got so deeply upset he actually knocked their hat off in the pub, committed an assault. But of course, because he was an aspiring politician who used to be a politician, he wasn't charged, not by the police at Graham. They wouldn't be in anybody's pocket, would they? And then, 2 months ago,
Look at this.
Barnaby Joyce, the Dead Drover's Dog Campaign, New England. 211 views, 14 likes, 2 dislikes. Wherein at I explained that the National Party's strategy was to not allow Barnaby to go anywhere near any public meetings where any of the press were notified. The senior journalist of the Glen Innes Examiner didn't know he was going to the Glen Innes Main Street to open the office until 1 hour previously. While the senior journalist was at the office waiting for Barnaby to arrive, he received a telephone call from Adam Marshall, the National Party's state member of Parliament for the Northern Tablelands. And Adam Marshall was in Glen Innes to open the library, where there was a new TAFE complex going up. He wanted the journalist to come down and cover the event. And the journalist had to say, "Oh, sorry, I'm here in the middle of the main street opposite the town hall waiting for Barnaby to come and open his office." And Adam Marshall, the National Party member for Northern Tablelands, did not know that Barneybaby Joyce, the pregnant father of the National Party from New England, was in town. Yeah, that's how secret the National Party was keeping it. The whole idea being that if the electorate could be kept in the dark, dumb, like mushrooms, kept in the dark, fed on bullshit, then they would go out and reflexively vote him back into power. But the fact is that now 50% of the National Party voters are women, and the mothers and the daughters and the sisters are not actually interested in supporting a sleazy lowhound, a man who will leave his wife and his 4 daughters to go and fuck the painted secretary. And so, as it was foretold within the prophecy, Barneybaby Joyce's karma has come to kick his arsehole until his nose bleeds. Herewith, yesterday's Sydney Telegraph. Bundle of Joyce. Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce is expecting a baby with a former staff member. Mr. Joyce has refused to comment on his relationship with ex-journalist Vicky Campion, 33, since it emerged last year that his decades-long marriage to Natalie Joyce, the mother of his 4 kids, had broken down. A source said Mr. Joyce had been, quote, struggling with the family breakup, unquote, and encountered, quote, some pretty dark times, unquote. But friends say the new couple who are living together are, quote, madly in love. Shit, yeah, she looks really happy, doesn't she, Barney? Ms. Campion pictured yesterday walking near her home in Canberra. They're living together, which means Barneybaby Joyce is not actually residing within his electorate. Is due to give birth about April. She left Mr. Joyce's office in April last year to work for one of his closest colleagues, Matt Canavan. Full report, pages 4 and 5. Oh, and haven't they skewered the poor silly bastard? In the centre there, they have the original headline. Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce is expecting a baby with a younger former member of his staff and confessing to friends that he is madly in love. Mr. Joyce, who opposed same-sex marriage and abstained from the vote in Parliament, confirmed the breakdown of his 24-year marriage to Natalie Joyce, the mother of his 4 children, during the debate over the legislation last year. But even as rumours and innuendo swept Canberra and the campaign trail during the New England by-election, Mr. Joyce, 50, refused to address the subject of his new relationship with former media advisor Vicky Campion, 33. The Daily Telegraph can reveal the couple have moved in together and are expecting their first child around April. Friends have told the Daily Telegraph the pair are madly in love. However, Mr. Joyce is understood to be very concerned about the welfare of his 4 daughters in their late teens and early 20s. He has been struggling with the family breakup. It's put an enormous pressure on him, one source said. Well, considering that 3 days before the by-election, one of his daughters got the keys of the Barnaby Joyce campaign vehicle with the PA system and was driving around the suburbs of Tamworth telling everybody not to vote for Daddy because he's a sleazy scumbag who 2-timed her mother, it's probably not surprising that he's found himself under a little bit of pressure. The Christian, Catholic, conservative, family values Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, leader of the National Party, the bloke who likes to think himself morally and ethically superior to anybody and everybody who's not voting for his side. The quote continues, he's had some pretty dark times. Ms. Campion, a former journalist and Deputy Chief of Staff at the Daily Telegraph, was pictured walking near her home in Canberra yesterday. She declined to comment on her relationship with Mr. Joyce. Ms. Campion left Mr. Joyce's office in April last year to work for one of his closest colleagues, Resources Minister Matt Canavan, in a more senior role. When Mr. Canavan resigned from Cabinet amid questions over his Italian citizenship, she joined the office of National's Chief Parliamentary Whip, Damien Drum. She then lost her job when Mr. Drum moved from his role as Whip to the Assistant Minister to the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce's office declined to comment about his personal situation or the upcoming birth, but said Ms. Campion was no longer working for the Turnbull government. Due to ministerial changes at the reshuffle last year, the staff member's contract ended, unquote, he said. Quote, bracket, she, unbracket, is subject to the same provisions as all other staff, unquote. Mr. Joyce and Natalie attended the Canberra Press Gallery midwinter ball together in June last year. Right, so as of June last year, Natalie didn't know this was going on, even though the staffer had to leave the office because she was fucking the boss in April. Mr. Joyce, by the time the Nationals leader was forced to contest the New England by-election, Natalie and his 4 daughters were nowhere to be seen on the campaign trail, with Mr. Joyce publicly confirming he was not living at home. In October, the Daily Telegraph reported Mr. Joyce had been dealing with a crisis in his personal life at the same time as he was preparing to fight for his New England seat after he was forced to resign for holding New Zealand citizenship. Despite the crisis in his personal life, Mr. Joyce comfortably won the New England by-election with a 12.6% swing towards him and a 65% of the primary vote. Mr. Joyce, who is a Catholic and has spoken often of his conservative social and economic values, took a strong stance against same-sex marriage, advocating for, quote, the current definition of marriage, unquote, before abstaining from the final parliamentary vote on December 7. I don't come to this debate pretending to be any kind of a saint, but I do believe in the current definition of marriage, which has stood the test of time, he said. I acknowledge that I'm currently separated, so that's on the record. It's a special relationship between a man and a woman, predominantly for the purpose of bringing children into the world, if you are so lucky, noting that many people aren't. Mr. Turnbull declined to comment on whether he had been informed about the office romance involving his deputy, as it were foretold within the prophecy.